Okay. Now, in the future, we will know that we existed because we have a recording. So we are delighted, honored, and grateful to have Rabbi Ariel Mayse with us. And Ariel, is that the correct pronunciation of your last name?
Yeah, I mean, no one knows and no one agrees, so that's great.
Okay. Teku. When Eliyahu comes, you'll have the correct
Exactly.
pronunciation of your name. Um, Meanwhile, Ariel is a professor at Stanford in Jewish studies and is involved with Atik is the correct name, yes?
Mhm.
And Ariel, maybe you can say a little bit more about yourself and what you do there. And Ariel is already uh, made a name for himself in Jewish ecological thinking and writing, I think it's fair to say, uh, and has, I think, had already an influence, which is good. We need positive, inspiring influencers. So Ariel, please, the proverbial floor is yours, and I'm here to dialogue with you or to moderate, but please feel free to take us onward and upward.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan. How long do our jam sessions usually last? What's the
Um,
aim?
about 6 hours. No, we do go for about
Perfect.
an hour, and we can go over a few minutes if people are willing, but we usually aim for about an hour.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Yeah, I've got at least 10 hours of material, so an hour should be perfect. First time I've ever been called an influencer. And if I've accomplished anything, it's because I've had wonderful teachers, several of whom are on this call, and it's just wonderful to be here with you all today. Yeah, so I work in the religious studies department at Stanford. I teach mostly Hasidism, Jewish mysticism, Jewish thought, philosophy of Jewish law, things like that. Over the past 5 years, my work has really migrated away from that, however, and into the realms of Judaism, ecology, environmental ethics, and things of that nature. Um, Not entirely an accident. I went to UC Davis, which is an ag school, and I grew up in Fresno, California, which is in the middle of the state. Both my parents were involved in agriculture and in sustainable agriculture before it was really even a thing. And in a certain sense, I, as a religious seeker and as a religious person, had not existed in two different worlds, but I had known that there must be some interplay in between my religious self and my environmental activist self. And over the past 5 years, this has really become, I would say, the heart of my work. I work, in addition to teaching at Stanford, I work with an organization called Atik, the Jewish Maker Institute, which is an applied arts yeshiva that seeks to nourish embodied spirits of belonging and creative confidence in Jewish tradition for individuals, families, and communities. And the aim of this place is to provide individuals with a way of doing deep Jewish learning and deep art practice without having to choose between the two of them. I also work with the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society, an organization that seeks to advance scholarship and social transformation by bringing Jewish spiritual teachings to bear on the critical moral and existential challenges of our day. Other than that, I live here in Berkeley, um, Ohlone land, and am really happy to be with you all today. So, in what follows over the next 51 minutes, give or take, I'd like to invite us to consider together the interface of song, Sabbath, place, rest, and time. Again, song, Sabbath, place, rest, and time. These are foci of life, theaters of experience that interweave one with the other. And in what follows, I'd like to consider the way that the practice of the Sabbath, can become a technology for attunement, or better, a technique, a ritual of attunement that increases the possibility of listening, that increases the possibility of listening. So far, so good? All right, fantastic. So I'm going to share my screen, assuming that I have the permissions to do so, which I do. And I'd like us to actually begin with a poem by Wendell Berry. Can I ask someone to read it out loud for us? Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. This is a poem you may have seen before. Wendell Berry, the philosopher, poet, activist, author, novelist,
I'll read it.
farmer, and then some. Please, Marilyn. Yeah.
Okay. The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Thanks. So, is this a poem about time or space? And please just come off mute. I can only see some of you. I'd love to see all of you. Just come off mute.
It's both. Time and space are connected.
Uh-huh. So Sean says time and space are connected. How are they connected? How do you see them working together here?
088000941.
Oh, you said it way too fast.
Sean, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, my journey in this space, this area, took me to whether or not humans are bound by space or bound by time.
Uh-huh.
And I eventually got back to time space from Professor Einstein. And they're connected in the world of physics, but I think they're connected spiritually as well.
Great. So what Einstein taught us, ironically, is true about time and space. The dimensional aspects of time is also true about what Bergson would teach us about time, which is that time is both a thing on a clock, but it's also an experience that we enter into. And it's something that we have a kind of, he describes it as the phenomenology of time, that there is something that we can step inside. And that's not necessarily the same thing on a clock. Everyone has had the experience, I'm sure in some sense, of looking at a clock after some expanse in the wilderness, or a particular moment with another person, or any other time, any other moment in which things flex in a way that is kind of hard to put your finger on, and that which had been only 10 minutes feels like hours, or vice versa. Hours are compacted into seconds, and that's our experience of them. Here, time allows us to step into a different kind of, well, what is it? We're going out into the wilderness or into the wild. It's a moment of repose, a moment of peace, a moment of abeyance of the concerns of the humdrum, while at the same time a kind of celebration of the ordinary. So time and space work together, both in the sense of this being carved out within the clock, but also hewn out of the clock, but also temporary, temporal, temporary. For a time, I rest. Sometimes when I teach this poem, I ask students to write their own conclusion of it. For a time, I rest in, and to see where they find their rest. I think it's a poem that invites that. Okay, what else is alive in this poem for you collectively? Andy, please.
Yeah, I really love this poem. I am fixated on the last line and the last word, and specifically the idea of being free, freedom,
Yeah.
uh, and the fact that the voice in the poem is not doing anything in the sense of none of these things are impacting. Suppose it is Mr. Barry. I mean, it's not impacting Mr. Barry at all. I mean, it is impacting him, but he's not doing anything with it. He's not possessing anything here. He's just in it. And that seems to be the definition of freedom that's being offered. And I just find that very fascinating because freedom is such a complicated concept and there are different arguments of what does it mean to be free. And this definition of freedom here is very much about just being in the presence of something.
Yeah. I mean, Isaiah Berlin has this famous two typologies of freedom, the freedom from and the freedom to. And hiding behind both of those is a kind of Nietzschean understanding of freedom. And this is neither of those, although it's closest. In a certain sense, it's freedom from the shackles of um, things that prevent us from stepping into peace. But it's also freedom to, but not freedom to create or freedom to do this or freedom to do that. It's freedom to be, freedom to step into a place where you are not the master, freedom to step into a place where you are a part of a economy of life, an ecology, as it were, to observe and to listen, to relinquish rather than to hold. Fantastic. Thank you, Andy. Many of you are probably familiar with Abraham Joshua Heschel's famous description of the Sabbath as a palace in time. And while I think that's a beautiful image, Heschel puts most of his cards down on the table of the Sabbath being about time, which is obvious. It's about time. A beautiful way that you see this in the medieval sources is that one of the great poets of the medieval period describes not Jonah, the dove, the Yonah, the dove that Noah releases, that finds rest amid the swirls of the flood. He describes it as finding rest on the day of the Sabbath. So just as the dove finds rest from the swirling flood, we find rest and respite on the Sabbath. So he's painting in time terms what the Hebrew Bible tells us in space terms. But the Sabbath is also about space and about places that we can go and places that we exist where that freedom is not only the freedom not to check my phone, but the freedom to be a listener. Great. What else is alive? Why does the speaker wish to go to this place? Do we get the sense that he goes on a repeated basis? Perhaps once a week? We don't know.
I'd like to say something about that.
Please, Marilyn.
I notice that yesterday I managed to carve out time just to lie on the hammock in our garden.
Mm-hmm.
And I experienced my breath, I sort of followed my breath and admired the trees. And one of the things I try to do is make friends with the trees just in our backyard, which means relating to them. I know there's an indigenous way of speaking about trees as tree people, and only recently have I begun to feel that the trees in our yard are tree people. They're not people, but they're beings, and they're living beings.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes me quite a while to unwind enough
Mhm.
to rest in, I love this phrase, the grace of the world. And I think that the calamity that we're in is partly related to the loneliness we feel because we can't relate to the earth and the trees. And the calamity includes also having difficulties relating to other people because we're in a rush. And so I found after about an hour of calming down and relaxing that I was in a sort of type of Shabbat afternoon true respite. But I've noticed sometimes it takes me all day Shabbat, the whole day, to settle down enough to feel that sense of grace and peace. And I actually think it's available, much, much more available than we think it is.
So it's available at certain times. It's also available to all those who wish to look for it, but it's also something, Marilyn, as you pointed out, that doesn't come immediately and it doesn't come easily. It's something that requires preparation. And sometimes that preparation is hard work, whether that is the hard work of inner contemplative work or the hard work of actually just letting go, which is not necessarily a simple thing, and allowing oneself to become, I mean, one of the words that comes to me from this, which Barry doesn't use, is allowing oneself to become entangled, to allowing oneself to become entangled into a world that we often see ourselves as separate from. There's a great book called Remembering Our Intimacies, which is a book written from a Hawaiian perspective about what the author describes as the nets of intimacy that bind us to the world that we often forget about. These nets of intimate attachment, these kind of frameworks of connection, which we often forget about, are there. And they are there not for the taking, they are there for the resting. Now, it is a beautiful poem. I'm also troubled by certain elements of this poem. I'm troubled by one thing in particular, which is the word wild. Wilderness is something beautiful. Has anyone read Nash's book, The Wilderness and the American Mind? I can only see some people. Has anyone read it? Yeah. Okay, Ellen's read it. It's a book that I found very counterintuitive the first time I read it, and then I found it to be really helpful, because the argument laid out there is that this notion of wilderness or wildness as this pristine, untouched place where no footsteps or human footsteps have tread, which has guided so much of the American imagination, and by here I mean the American colonial imagination, isn't the only way of looking at the world around us. I remember when I was coming up in grade school, my AP European history textbook was called The Enduring Vision, and it had this white guy up on a cliff gazing out over the expanse of what I now know are the plains and the Rockies, and it was nothing. It was just empty space waiting to become onion fields. That obviously did a tremendous disservice to the biodiversity. It does a tremendous disservice to the peoples who lived there and were being killed. But it also tells you something about the way in which the idea of space as being valuable or powerful only to the extent that it is wild is a part of the American consciousness. I just got back from a 2-week trip to Yellowstone with my family. And anyone been to Yellowstone? Yeah? I found it to be an incredible place, a place second to none in many respects. And at the same time, there are 21 First Peoples with unceded claims to Yellowstone who don't see it as a national park that you go into and then leave, but see it as a place that you engage with and live with. And that's a very different way of understanding this kind of entanglement, something that is not only temporary, but something in which we are a part of this world, not just for a time, but here going, Marilyn, back to what you were saying about the opportunity being there, not in a in a blue moon, as it were, but in a kind of perennial sense, is very important to me in my understanding of this. Another thing about this, Marilyn, you said you got this in your backyard with the trees. I certainly felt this in Yellowstone. I saw this grizzly bear when I was there. Grizzlies are the sort of like animating feature of my imagination, and I felt this for a very short time. Is this only available in a wilderness like Yellowstone? Where else might one find this? Once more?
I think it takes more work, more preparation, more mindset. But, speaking of Wendell Berry, his wilderness experiences tended to be in his own backyard. And, I'm one that seeks after, great experiences in the wilderness. I do extended backpacking trips, whether it be in California. I was in Colorado this past summer and spent 3 weeks hiking. But that's that's where I find closeness with creation, but that requires a great investment of time and skill and other things. I wish I could learn to find that right here in my backyard. I'm not quite there yet. I think, in my mind, I have to go to the wilderness, but sometimes the wilderness is right outside the door. If we can get a mindset for that, and I'm not there yet.
Yeah. I kind of wish that we could, ask Barry to just replace wild in the title with something else. I'm not exactly sure what the word would be, but it doesn't have to be wild in order for it to be transformative. It doesn't have to be wild in order for it to be eye-opening. It doesn't have to be wild for it to be heart-opening. Yeah, please. Kara?
Yes, hi, thanks, Cara.
Hi.
Yeah, if we think of even I happen to live on the top of a mesa, a phenomenally expansive environment in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. But for those who do not live in this wild, even just holding a pencil, if that sense of intimacy, I wrote in the chat before, an interspecies intimacy, where we can be deeply, so instead of wild, perhaps attuned, paying a deep noticing, where there's a sense of the story of the wood from the pencil, where there's such a profoundly ability to responsibility to the pencil as an expanse of this mystical world that we call nature.
Of which we are a part, of which the pencil is a part, of which all these wild things are a part, but it's not restricted to them, nor is it restricted to the beautiful mesa in the Rockies. Here I found something, and it's on the source sheet that I'll share with you. I found a way of thinking from Barry Lopez, the great travel writer who wrote Arctic Dreams and a number of other truly spectacular books. In his last book called The Syntax of the River, it's an interview with him over a few days, he talks about how one builds up this ability to listen to places. And it's not just wilderness, although it includes wilderness. Barry's advice is pick a place and become an apprentice. And so I think, Sean, his advice to you would be spend more time in the backyard, sit in the same spot, get to know the tree, get to know the dragonflies, get to know the insects, get to know what Aldo Leopold would call the land community, and it will open up and it will begin to wink at you, and it will just take that time. And it's not the same as a mesa, it's not the same as a grizzly bear, it's not the same as Yellowstone. On the other hand, it's available. And so here, I wonder what would happen if you took Barry's title and just truncated it to the piece of things. When I was in grad school, I had a chapter title with 2 words in it, and one of my doctoral advisors looked at it and he said, Do you really need both of those words? And I chopped one of them out and it was great. I wonder what would happen if we started thinking of this not only in the piece of wild things, but if we also included, and Jonathan, you pointed out, this is not like uninhabited land. This is very habited land. This land is inhabited by wood drakes and herons and all the insects that he doesn't matter. He happens to that he doesn't mention. He happens to refer directly to the birds and the brook, but there's so much else there. All of these things are available to us outside of our door and to a certain degree inside of our door. And I think we might actually do well to move beyond the frame of there's this wild place, but we're not there, and think about what might happen if that is more accessible. Okay, pick a place and become an apprentice. So I'd like to move now into a source from the very early 19th century, late 18th, very late 19th century, very early 20th century, from Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter of Ger. Ger is a tiny town outside of Warsaw. He lived most of his time in Warsaw, some of his time outside of Warsaw in this suburb. And he gives us you might say it's a kind of like Summa Theologica of Hasidic thought, of Jewish mystical thought, toward the end of the 19th century and at the very beginning of the 20th century. One of the things that I love so much about this book is that it says in very simple and accessible language lots of the secrets that the Kabbalists, the medieval mystics, had distilled over many years. But one of the things that I like about it so much is that it's a book written in an urban environment. It's not just a pastoral book thinking back about how beautiful the forests are, although there is some of that. It's a book written in the process of the urbanization of Poland and of the industrialization of Poland. And as such, I think it is a vital resource for us thinking in our own sort of carbon-driven world about where the life of the Spirit may take us. Okay, any questions about that author? Could spend a lot of time talking about him. Has anyone encountered his teachings before? Yeah. Arthur Green published a translation of his work. Professor Heschel used to love and teach this work at the Jewish Theological Seminary on occasion. And his book, the Sfat Emet, perhaps translated as The Language of Truth, is really one of the all-stars of the later Hasidic canon. Can I ask someone to read? Again, I think that worked well. From My Grandfather and Teacher. Should be there smack dab in the middle of your screen. Ellen, are you volunteering?
Yeah, I can't find it. I'm trying to. You said in the middle of the screen?
I think so.
My grandfather, or is that
Yeah.
start there? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. My grandfather and teacher used to say this about the wells our ancestors dug. Everywhere there is a hidden point of God. We only have to remove the external covering in order to reveal that innermost point, which is called a well of living waters. On weekdays, this well is called esek or sitna, preoccupation or accusation, but on the Sabbath, it is called rehovot, expanse. The words of the wise are gracious.
Okay, perfect. Hold there, Ellen. Thank you. So the words of the wise are gracious, divrei vi chacham chen. It means close quote in these medieval or early modern sources. So here you have a tradition quoted in the name of this person's grandfather, in the name of this person's ancestor and teacher. So what does this person's ancestor and teacher say?
It's all right there. We just have to remove the veil, basically. Everything is just hidden under.
You just got to dig a little. I think that's the metaphor that he's working with. So where is God?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. You've probably heard the famous teaching attributed to the Rebbe of Kotsk, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, where is God? God is wherever you let God in. This is not, which he probably didn't say, but he could have said it, and maybe he should have said it. This is not totally dissimilar from that. Where is God? God is everywhere. That vitality, that shimmering quality of divinity, that sacred power is available where? Of course, it's
Everywhere.
available in the wilds, but everywhere, indeed. It's hidden, it's concealed. So, what must we do?
Remove the stone.
Abre los ojos.
Yeah, open the eyes, exactly. Remove the stone that was put on top of the well, fantastic. Pierce through the mantle of our ordinary consciousness. There's a way of reading this which is very destructive, a kind of industrial well digging. I don't think that's what he means at all. I think he means the kind of attentiveness where that which was in plain sight but unnoticed suddenly becomes revealed. So, what does it mean that he calls this innermost point of divinity a well of living waters? It's a well of water of life. A well being something that a be'er doesn't run dry. It's a sort of artesian power of divinity, as opposed to a cistern or something like that that can be filled with water. He's using the language of the book of Genesis. Of course, he's talking about the stories of Abraham digging a well, then the well gets filled in, then they redig the wells, then Isaac digs the wells, and then they get redug, and then Jacob with the well, and this well, and that well. And there are all these stories about wells, and Ishmael is sent out to a well and then sees God at this place, and it's not clear what the name of that well is, but it is Be'er Lachai Roi, the well of divine seeing or something like that. It's also the language of the Song of Songs. So here the landscape is being rewrapped in that language of love and connection and entanglement. Ellen, can I make a plug for your new book about the Song of Songs, soon to be available? An ecological reading of that very profound and wondrous book. So what's the difference between the weekdays and the Sabbath then? If we're really living on this aquifer of divinity, what's the difference?
Somehow it's the hidden point
Mm-hmm.
is more accessible
Mm-hmm.
at that time.
There's a kind of expansiveness that comes along with the Sabbath. And during the week, it is Sitna and Esek. These are the names that are given to wells that people fought over. So Esek is, it's also business. Esek means striving, and it means struggle, and it means business and busyness. Sitna, accusation. Hitnagdut, a kind of contra. Those are our ordinary sort of weekday consciousnesses. In other words, we see the world not as a translation of that divine infinity, but as myriad particulars without seeing the wholeness. We see only the particulars. We see only the opposition. We see only the threads rather than the tapestry. But on the Sabbath, something opens up. Here he's also thinking about this famous comment from Rashi, one of our great medieval commentators, who in the Talmud, it is said that one receives an extra soul on the Sabbath, a neshama yetera. Rashi there in his commentary, he's an 11th century French commentator. Rashi says it's an extra measure of open-heartedness that we reach for on the Sabbath. He calls it harchavat halev. Rechovot, expansiveness here. Harchavat halev. Open-heartedness. Open-eyedness, perhaps we would say. So keep going, Ellen, if you don't mind. But Scripture says,
But Scripture says, wisdom cries out in public in the streets, also Rehoboth. It sounds its voice. The sound of Torah is always there to arouse the hearts of Israel. We have only to turn our ears, as the Holy Zohar says, there is no one who turns their ear. Scripture also says, if you hear my voice, as well as because Abraham heard my voice. The divine voice is always present. It comes from the 10 utterances by which the world was created and the 10 commandments by which God gave the power of divine words to all of creation. On the Sabbath,
yeah, thanks, Ellen. So, Jonathan, in the chat, I can see that you're reminding us about the importance of noise here. Noise as kind of like the mantle that covers over the water, the aquifer, or like the crust upon it. Noise is that which occludes. Noise is that which prevents. Noise is that which prevents us from being able to sense, to see, to listen to that which is beyond the surface and within the surface. Noise is that which papers over the great abyss of power that is always there. On the Sabbath, things get a little quieter. Is the author of this source in agreement with his grandfather? Or is he kind of tilting that teaching in a little bit in the what Ellen just read for us?
Could you repeat your question, please?
Sure. The first half of this is about the fact that during the week, we live in a world surrounded by noise and opposition, with preoccupation. On the Sabbath, things open up. Things transform. The well of living waters becomes more apparent to us. The peace of wild things becomes more apparent to us. The peace of things becomes more apparent to us in a way that's hard to get when we're in line at the grocery store or standing in a post office or working at our day jobs. That openness of the Sabbath is the great gift of Shabbat. The second part of this teaching, starting with but Scripture says, at least in my reading, kind of moves in a slightly different direction. Well, maybe I should say it differently. It's not a no pivot, it's a yes and pivot. The yes and pivot is, sure, that is true of the Sabbath, but is that unique to the Sabbath? What does he say? Wisdom cries out in public in the streets, it sounds its voice.
Andy, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I don't know if I have the right answer. It's a great question. I do sense a pivot there. I sense that the attitude has become a bit more cynical in that paragraph. Perhaps maybe not cynical, but it's lamentable. The author is lamenting the fact that this expanse, this well, this redwood is available, but people aren't taking advantage of it. That even in the presence of the well or the expanse, you might have people that don't want to drink, which could be the tragedy. I don't know if that's right. I'm just
Yeah. I think there's certainly an element of lament here in that it is, as it were, right there, waiting for people to drink from it, waiting for people to slake their thirst in the spiritual qualities that are ever flowing. On the other hand, I don't know if it's cynical. And I think it's also a tone of bewilderment in that the author of this source, Rabbi Alter, is saying, of course things are accessible on the Sabbath, but wisdom, Sophia, the divine word, as we'll find out in just a minute, that kind of sacred vitality is always there, crying out, calling out to us. Here he describes it as the sound of Torah, The richness of ancestral wisdom and instruction is always there. All we need to do is what? As the Zohar says?
Incline our ears.
Yeah, incline the ears. Open the eyes, incline the ears. Is that a Shabbat only activity? I don't think so. Because the next part is the divine voice is always present. Our world reverberates with divine voice. It shimmers with divinity, and it reverberates with the divine voice. The 10 creative acts which give rise to the world, the 10 commandments of revelation, which are always happening, mean that this world is one in which God's voice, the sacred voice, the voice of ancestral wisdom, never falls silent. So why does Abraham go to the land of Israel? Abraham goes to the land of Israel not because Abraham was chosen and no one else was chosen, but because in the Zohar's imagination, Abraham is the only one who opened his ears to that which was being constantly spoken to all human beings. And in that sense, it's not about election, but about commitment. And in that sense, it's about how one can open one's eyes and open one's ears. Indeed, this is a challenging and formidable pivot, for sure. But I think you're right, Michael. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. The Zohar is, I think, frankly, kind of cynical, for sure. The Zohar is like, a 13th century text. No one pays attention to Kabbalah. No one really understands the secrets except the 10 or 15 people who are involved in this book. I don't think that that's the case in this source, which is like, imagine him talking to these people in Warsaw. Imagine these people, right? Warsaw in the 1870s, which is not surrounded in smoke to the same degree that England is, but it's an urban population that's becoming more and more urban and will become all the more so after the pogroms in the 1880s, which really shift the tilt of the population of Jews into urban environments. This is something that could have been said in Manhattan. This is something that could have been said in San Francisco. It's something that could have been said in a great urban center, in Berlin. The world is filled with God's voice. All you need to do is to open your ears. Okay, Ellen, finish it up for us.
On the Sabbath, right?
Yeah.
On the Sabbath, Israel testifies that the world and all its fullness belongs to God. Then the divine voice is awakened. It is easy to hear that voice on the holy Sabbath. In Rehovot, in the expanse of Shabbat, she sounds her voice.
So the word here is street, Rehov or Rehovot, streets, and Rahav, expansiveness. So he's saying, yes, indeed, on the Sabbath, the voice of this divinity is awakened. Jonathan, you pointed out in the chat that in the early months of COVID, many of us heard things that we had never heard in our world. We saw things that we didn't see in our ordinary way of acting, in part because there were fewer cars, in part because there were fewer airplanes, in part because there were fewer ambient noises, and in part because there were fewer demands on our attention. And then shortly after that, we were all thrust into a digital civilization that none of us were prepared for. At least I wasn't prepared for, and it felt like there were more demands on my time and attention. But there was that time in which it felt like the peace of wild things coexisted in a tremendously complicated and tragic way with the devastation all around us. If anyone was in New York during this time, it was silence shattered only by ambulances. And that was a complexity of that particular time. What I think Rabbi Alter here is driving at, the last quote is his rewriting of the earlier reading of Proverbs 120. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Exactly. So he says two things about that quote from the book of Proverbs. Scripture says, God's voice resounds in the street. That's true. The Rehovot, the streets, also have divine speech. It's like an echo chamber of God's voice. On the other hand, the expansiveness, rachav, of Shabbat gives us the peace to find that voice which was there all along. The streets are different. We are different. The heart is different. So my question then is, how does one do this? How does one become attuned in this way? Yeah, Kara.
So I have a question to dovetail with your
Sure.
question.
Please.
Again, going back to interspecies intimacies and supply chain consciousness, where we are embodying through our spiritual intelligence the embodied energy of the asphalt on the street, of the concrete, how the concrete was produced with sand, how the sand was transported, the people's lives, the miners, the quarry from which the minerals were stripped, witnessing what is through, again, a supply chain profoundly inquiry-based relationship to these objects in our streets, of our streets.
Yeah, whether it's the streets themselves or the shoes that we wear and the grasses around us, all of these things come at a tremendous cost. I think you're absolutely right to draw our attention to what would happen if we paid this not only a spiritual sense, but also an ethical sense. What's the ethical ask that this source makes of us? Is it just the consciousness of that? Yeah, roundup, fantastic, good. Yeah, making room for the sound of the divine voice, and also making room for those voices that are perhaps complicated. The costs of our industrial world. Yeah, please, Jonathan.
Yeah, I also feel like in a way that's similar but different to the Wendell Berry poem, here too, I feel like what I'm trying to go back to your question, what makes that possible is a kind of act, a cognitive act, an act of cognition. Maybe cognition isn't the right word, but a mental act, which would be very typical of Hasidism. You know, your mind is, the world is what your mind constructs it as, and if you are able to acknowledge or see the world as divine, as fully divine here, then you see or hear things differently.
Good. I think you know, it is cognitive. It's certainly it's about mind, and in Hasidism, mind and body are intertwined. They can't be removed one from the other. So it's not intellectual in the sense of we think of it in like our post-Cartesian world, but it is one of creating or cultivating a spiritual sense, a spiritual sensibility. Another great exploration of this, if you haven't read Douglas Christie's Blue Sapphire of the Mind, it's a path-breaking book on the art and practice of contemplative ecology. He does for the church fathers and ancient patristic sources what I'm hoping someday someone will do in the Jewish sources, which is thinking forward as to what kinds of techniques, rituals, and commands to attention we have in our tradition that really breed this sense of placement and a strong sense of place that also has a moral underpinning. Of course, Ellen, you're doing this in a somewhat different way in your books. Please, Ellen, keep going.
Let's see. I just wanted to say that one of the things that I like about this, well, first, I just wanted to say that I always had a hard time with Heschel about his concentration on time. And so I love that you're doing this. And then I was thinking about the word Rehovot, which is also like the streets, but also the expanse of time. So it's both. So I like that. And the other thing I wanted to say is just about like, how do we do this? So for community is incredibly
Mhm.
and it's like I go because I feel like I have to for not any outer source telling me I have to, but for my own stability and um um I just feel like just being in shul around community, kind of just being there,
Mhm.
it helps elevate a presence
Yeah.
and that I don't get by myself. So
It's a community is one of these things that we see in other people where we wish to go. We receive energy from them. We see the divine in them. There are all sorts of different ways that this transpires. And this really brings me to my next and final point, which is that one of the ways that we do this is through the craft of song. We've been talking about listening, but I think listening and song go together, and that's true in the biological sense, and it's certainly true in our human experience. Um, Synagogues are many things. They're places of learning, they're places of worship, they're places of connection, they're also places of song. And song has that wonderful and complicated and beautiful quality that when we talk over each other, nothing really good happens. But when we sing together, the richness, the sort of brocade of voices, the tapestry of the voices becomes richer the more people are able to contribute to that. And synagogues are one place in which we have that. It's also interesting, one of the things that Zoom didn't ever figure out how to do was allow people to sing together because of lag, because of all sorts of things, but it just never worked. And it's one of these things that we can do in person that we can't do in a digital world. But Ellen, I think your point is a really good one. And I don't know if Alicia, I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly, but I think it links us to what you just said, which is that we rest in beauty, we rest in time, we rest in space, and we don't do so alone. And the community is not just the community of people, although it is that. And it's not only the community of space, but it's also the community of species. And here, this, I think, brings us back to one of Wendell Berry's other great points, which he doesn't make here, but he makes elsewhere, which is that our world is a communion of subjects, not a communion of objects. And in that being the case, we are surrounded by others who are also intertwined, entangled with us. Thomas Berry, thank you. Um, who are intertwined and entangled in such a way that we cannot divide our song from their song or our noise from their noise. David Haskell, the author, has written a beautiful book about this and about noise and evolution and the way that song and flowers and insect song and flowers came to be at the same time, and the way that song and sound and co-evolution transpire really over the past, I guess, 200 million years. Before then, song led to death, but then you were eaten by a predator. But after that point, animals got wings, frogs had legs for jumping, um, animals had climbed out of the water and developed larynxes, which could then be turned into not just ways of stopping water from going down our throat, but also opening up into song. And then flowers created this new kind of outpouring of energy. And um, then mammals hit the stage a little bit later in history, and his theory, which I don't know, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, is that um, the need to drink milk changed the throats of mammals in such a way that enabled different kinds of speech, which is also related to our environment. It's also true that that song and um, song and sexuality, which emerged sometime around that same time period, um, in which reptiles and insects change the way that they mate, where they're not just casting out into space and seeing what happens, but they're actually conjoining with others of their local community, led to different kinds of local adaptations and subspecies. All of these things go together. I remember the first time I heard this from David, and when I read this in his book, it opened up for me a passage that I had seen many, many years ago, which is the passage from Rabbi Nachman here that I think a lot of you have probably seen before, which is the story of a shepherd. And the story of the shepherd is that the shepherd wanders around and collects melodies from all of the places that they go. They collect the melodies of the grasses, of the different forms of vegetative life, which I like to imagine as literally the sounds of different kinds of trees, of different kinds of vegetation, but also the melodious quality of life there. But it's also true that those that those vegetative forms of life, which are linked to a particular time and place, have animal companion species, I guess we could say it that way, that live there and sometimes eat only certain things, but certainly are adapted to that particular place, and they have their own sounds, their own noises, their own ways of creating a vocal world. And the shepherd doesn't just stay in that one place, but wanders from place to place, seeing the grass, seeing the animals, and listening to them. And yeah, amazing. I love this. I'm learning so much. I didn't know this about trees. So the world around us is a kind of cacophony of music that we use then to weave our own songs. And I love this notion that human culture and human song is not just metabolized from the world around us, but is linked to us, and we weave or stitch or combine those sounds into our own songs. And if you think about all musical instruments, they're made from the world around us, either literally from the bones or from the carbonic forms of those of things that have come long ago. But it's also true of the human quality of speech and the human quality of song. Our ability to make those noises that we are using right now that convey information is to a certain degree special, but it is not unique. So Rabbi Nachman says, this is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, late 18th, early 19th century, that the world is filled with the wings of song. Mikanafa aretz zmirot shamanu. We hear song from the ends of the earth. And all of these things come together into our song. And through singing, says Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, in a kind of sacred ecology, we receive the melody, but we also give back to the melody. And so here I think the ethical, he's framing it as a kind of return arc of song in which we listen to the grasses and we listen to the animals and we sing. And through our song, they also receive. And it's a kind of, what's the opposite of a feedback loop? A network of reciprocity, of gift giving, in which you are building kinship. One of the things that David Haskell says is that by forgetting to listen, we have sundered one of the roots of the ethical, ... and that listening expands the possibilities of kinship. Listening expands the possibilities of kinship. So here, Kara's point about knowing the stories and listening to the stories, and here I'm thinking of song lines and the way that songs and place tell stories, and we need to remember all of those things. And with Ellen's point about the nature of community, which I think is absolutely true in synagogues and also absolutely true outside of synagogues, although we also know the feeling of being a lonely shepherd wandering around and not having those with whom to share this song. And that's not the simplest thing either. But I think Haskell's point is true. Listening expands the possibilities of kinship. So now I go back to Wendell Berry's point. For a time, I rest in the grace of, and I would invite each one of you to answer that in your own way. But I think one of the points that he is making there is what happens when we exist within that network of kinship. And that kinship is something that is bred by space. but not restricted to space. It's something that is literally bred by space and yet breathed into life through the power of listening. So I think I will, Jonathan, pause there, and I'm happy to stay on. Kara, I'd love to hear what you have to say. And thank you all for your brilliant comments. I didn't get to all of them because I can't watch everything at the same time. But thank you all so much. Yeah, please. Kara, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, your gift to us today. I'm curious about listening. I've been writing a lot about what it means to when the listener eviscerates. I'll use an aggressive term. What is being listened to? I'm saying this in a context of censorship, for example, with my photographs, or when we're speaking about climate chaos and presenting, for example, a lot of my work is around highlighting that renewable energies are not renewable, that they're rooted in fossil fuel economies. And many liberal environmentalists don't want to hear that, right? Because that's seen as salvation, that renewables are consumer salvation. So in this framework of listening that you're offering us, when the responsibility of the listener is seen as if they're just this passive, that it's all up to the storyteller to say what they're saying, either visually or verbally or in terms of our gestures, in a way that is palatable and digestible and that is easily receivable through mainstream, very, let's say, reductive ways of taking in information. This is a huge challenge that I've been trying to work through, and I'd be curious about your perspective.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, music is melodious and beautiful and wonderful and inclusive and all these things. And, it's not passive in that of the listener. It asks both openness and also physically, we know, like literally physically, according to physics, actually leaves an imprint on the person. On the other hand, one of the things that's powerful about music is that it can be discordant. And it can be like poetry. I just returned back to Seamus Haney's book about the purpose of poetry. I don't remember what it's called, the redress of poetry, something like that. And so one of the things that he highlights there is the necessity of poetry as a subversive cultural force. And music can be that. Music can also not be comforting, but discomforting. It can be disquieting in that sense. Meaning it's loud, obviously it's disquieting, but it can be disquieting in the sense that it actually calls people to revisit their assumptions, whether that is tonal assumptions or ethical assumptions. Anyone who has listened to, I remember the first time I heard like modern music, something by, what's his name, Philip Glass, or Sondheim or someone like this, and it's like, this is not what I think of in terms of music. And then I realized that there's something that they're doing and there's something that they're undoing. And so much of environmental and environmentalist discourse is about propping up the things that we think we know. And, I very much find myself on the progressive end on so many respects. But one of the things that I think that religion is actually really good at is challenging some of those first principles of contemporary environmentalist discourse, whether that is remembering that we need the ethical and the aesthetic, is what, Ellen is working on, or remembering that, the techno-optimism of either direct air capture or renewables are so firmly embedded with our contemporary economic structures that we can't disentangle them. And what we need is actually something much bigger and much more revolutionary. And that's not a simple thing for people to hear, and it's an absolutely essential thing for people to hear. I teach at Stanford. There's no problem at Stanford that can't be solved with technology. And I'm like, really? Nothing? And you look at the new faculty that they've created for the Doerr School of Sustainability, and you look at the number of people from the humanities who are there. There's almost no one there. And that's because the earth sciences can solve this problem. And they have a couple of people from law and a couple of people from economics, and they'll, sign off on the things. But what happens when we start challenging those fundamental assumptions, whether it's about the non-green green economy and the greenwashing of all those things, or whether it is let's actually start thinking about the nature of human reciprocity with the physical world and human versus nature and all sorts of other things, that can be discordant. And that too is the job of music. So thank you. Yeah, Jonathan, please.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you are talking about, discordant music and grizzly bears, because one of my responses to some of this material and the Wendell Berry poem in particular, and I love Wendell Berry and I love that poem, but when you talk about fundamental assumptions, one of the things that kind of sticks in my throat, since we're talking about throats, is that he, as you say, he uses the term wild in the title, but his vision of nature here, and I know he doesn't, this is not his universal vision, but his vision of nature here is very ironic, right? It's right out of the prophet. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. It's utopian. It's to me, it's very problematic because here again, environmentalism has to be romantic and it has to see everything as peaceful and harmonious, but that's not the way things are. And what I appreciate about the Zohar, among other sources, is that at least, well, I'm not going to compare and contrast them, but there a vision is offered which I personally find endlessly challenging. How do you see what seems problematic in life? How do you see death? How do you see pain, suffering? Ecosystems are not all about harmony and lying down in peace together. So how do you see all of that and still find it beautiful? And that enfolding of the all, meaning literally all of its aspects, the troubling ones, the difficult ones, the non-human ones, the et cetera, et cetera. So what do you say to that?
I think there are two different answers. One, Andy, this goes to your point, which is that there is a lot of, and Kara, to your point also, human misuse of that sacred energy that undergirds all. Human beings do tremendously problematic things with the world around us, whether that is a kind of extractive mentality vis-a-vis the world, or an extractive mentality vis-a-vis other people, or an extractive mentality vis-a-vis both of them together, entangled as they are. One of the things that I think Hasidism emphasizes and underscores is that the debasement of that kind of sacred vitality is one of the great dangers of pantheism, together with the enfolding of all things into what D.H. Lawrence calls that awful pudding of oneness, in which you don't pay attention to the particular, you only pay attention, your eyes sort of glaze and you pay attention to only the broad strokes. And I think that one of the things that Hasidism reminds us, and you see this, for example, in the second section of the Tanya, this great work of Hasidic theology from the first Rebbe of Chabad, he describes in Zoharic terms what he calls the Yehuda Ila'ah and the Yehuda Tata'ah, the higher kind of illuminated unitive consciousness, and then the lower kind of illuminated consciousness. So in the higher one, you see that everything is one, but that's temporary. And then you go back to understanding that ours is a world of multiplicity, of multi-species, of multi-everything, and that's not something to be waved away. That's something to be embraced. And the more species, the more beautiful. I mean, that's kind of the direction that he goes in, even though he doesn't say it in that same way. There's a kind of Hasidic biophilia hiding behind that, and I think it's really true. On the other hand, ours is a world of complexity and problems, and those need to be confronted and those need to be dealt with, whether that's with discordant movement, or that's with music, or that is with civil action or civil disobedience, or however it needs to happen. I think that there is tremendous room and tremendous need for that. And in terms of the world as a kind of romantic thing, he's talking about wood ducks and herons, and he's not talking about the fact that 1 out of every 2 ungulate calves in Yellowstone get eaten. by a grizzly bear. And like, you know, Schopenhauer and others taught us that the world is up, who is it? You know, of tooth and claw. Who is it? Someone. Tooth and
Um,
claw. Nature is red in tooth and claw.
Jack London.
No, I don't think so. Maybe it is.
Hobbes,
Anyway,
maybe?
who?
Is it Thomas Hobbes?
No, he's nasty, brutish, and short.
Good guesses.
Anyway, the nature as red in tooth and claw, like this image of nature as a place in which there is this kind of, you know, it's not a will to power, but a way in which everything is ripping itself apart and like everything is consuming something else. The nature is a beautiful place, even as the dramatic and violent place. Here I go back to that teaching from Rabbi Nachman and think about all the different kinds of music that is, because the animals are eating and they're being eaten. So it's a melodious version of what we call a trophic cascade, in which energy moves from one place to another, but it isn't all just all, you know, like the wood duck paddling. And I go back to that image because I think there is this, I don't know if it's an actual syndrome, but we talk about it a lot at Stanford, of undergraduates and other students who paddle along as if they're ducks on the surface, but they are coming apart under the water, and everything looks like it's fine until it's not, and everything falls apart. Yeah, Tennyson, thank you. So the I know it was one of those. This image is almost, I wouldn't say it's saccharine, but it feels very jejune in a way that is, you know, perhaps if we were to look at other parts of Barry's corpus would be different, but if we're looking here, it feels very naive and romantic, and that's great. On the other hand, that's not the only world we live in. And I think there, when he's writing about the strip mines of Appalachia and he's writing about the ways in which humans have done violence to each other and to the land, that also needs to be taken into account, and that too is both a violation of and an expression of a world that is filled with divinity.
Amen. Beautiful. Anyone else like to add a last word or two, or melody?
A couple comments, if I may. Jonathan, you reminded me, your comments reminded me of how quickly we slip into a racial hygiene and a purity of blood with the Sephardim who were expelled, for example, from Spain because of the lack of purity, and that this romanticization of nature, of course, Hitler's fixation on nature. So that very easy slippage into eugenics and what we're experiencing now in terms of property, ownership, entitlement, and property in relation to the proper, le propre, what is clean, you know, again, going back to what is digestible. And then just one of my favorite quotes by Wendell Berry, you cannot regulate an abomination, you must stop it.
Yeah. That's amazing. All right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been really wonderful, and I've learned a great deal from you all. And please be in touch if you have any questions or comments or things that we should continue thinking about. Love to be in touch. And Jonathan, thanks again for this invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. Rabbi Ariel, thank you so much. I want to just note that in the chat, Rabbi Ariel was kind enough to share his sources as a PDF. So if you want to see them, go to the chat now while I'm stalling. So you can do that, and you can download them. So thank you for that. And I also wanted to second Rabbi Ariel's comment about the brilliant comments in the chat, not because they're brilliant, although many of them are, but just to point out the collective wisdom here, which I just love. And it's one of the things that I find so meaningful and rewarding about doing this, is literally here this circle of, I don't know if we're elders or young adventurers or something else, but it's so beautiful to have exactly this chorus of different perspectives and facts and information, and wow, that's yeah, it's a kind of forest bathing for me. And Rabbi Ariel really good luck with all of your work. You are writing and thinking in really interesting and important ways, and keep it up. And I look forward to maybe having you back at some point to continue the conversation. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and for those who are keeping the Jewish calendar. I wish you all a wonderful, sweet, healthy, fruitful year full of love and really boring, nondescript weather. And to all of you, I look forward to seeing you again soon, here or elsewhere. In October, we will have a very different speaker, but also very interesting, Kate Soper, who is an English kind of Marxian thinker who has also been writing about, from a very different perspective, about non-consumerism, anti-consumerism, pleasure, and other related topics. So Ariel, thank you. Really, kol hakavod.
Thank you all so much, and I look forward to being in touch.
Likewise. Be well, everyone.
Take care. Thank you all.